Good morning, good afternoon, or maybe even almost good evening to some of you. I am Kathy. I am from the Asia-Europe People's Forum, and I will be moderating this webinar together with Charles Santiago, who will be taking over very shortly. The AEPF, Asia-Europe People's Forum, is a network of CSOs and social movements that works across Asia and Europe, clearly, on pro-people alternatives that challenge dominant economic, social, and political hegemonies. We work and we try to work together with all these organizations for an ecologically just and sustainable world, and to have these policies as well. We have biannual forums where we provide an input to the Asia-Europe heads of states in the ASEM meetings that also take place every 2 years. And so we would like to welcome you here in a dialogue with parliamentarians from across Europe and Asia. We have 2 parliamentarians from Europe and 5 from Asia. 2 of them will still be joining us in a few minutes, hopefully, if they can make it, because as everyone knows, there have been some emergencies all over the world, let's say, not only Asia and Europe. The APF has been working on a people's agenda for parliamentarians for over many years now. This can also be found on our website, aepf.info. And there it's also possible to endorse this agenda. And this, of course, we ask especially to parliamentarians from across Asia and Europe to endorse this and to sign on to this people's agenda and take forward the demands of the people from across those both regions. Throughout the session, we will be hearing the stories from different MPs in different regions and countries. For the attendees or the participants, we won't be able to see you, but you will be able to put in your comments in the chat box. And if there is anything that you would like to ask the panelists, then we request you to do this through the Q&A box to make sure that no questions get lost. We will take quite some time to address these questions as well. So please do put them in the Q&A box. If there's any practical questions, you can always send messages in the chat box. And this webinar will also be recorded, and the recording will be available on our Facebook page and on our website. So if you would like to re-look at it afterwards, then of course that is always possible. You will get a link to the recording a few days after this webinar. So that will be to every one of you. So now, apart from thanking the members of parliament who are already here and who are committing to express what they are living in their specific countries, I would like to give the word to Charles Santiago to introduce each one of them more in detail afterwards, and also to start as a speaker, because he's also one of our MPs in this session. Thank you so much, Charles.
Thanks, Kathy, and thanks for that quick introduction, very important introduction, comprehensive introduction. My name is Charles Santiago, and I'm also a member of the Asia-Europe People's Forum and member of the International Organizing Committee. And one of the things that we have been doing in the last 2-3 meetings of the Asia-Europe People's Forum, which is a bi-annual meeting, once in 2 years meeting, is an interface between parliamentarians and civil society. And here, civil society is defined as people's organizations, non-governmental organizations, trade unions, and a variety of other groups. And basically, this interface is supposed to feed into a people's agenda, which then can be used at different parliaments so that we can bring people's issues to the legislative assemblies for discussion, deliberations, and in fact, even lawmaking. So we have had this in the last meeting in Ghent, last Asia-Europe People's meeting in Ghent, we had Congresswoman Petra de Sutter, who had joined us. And I think her good luck was this. After she joined us, I must say, she became the Deputy Prime Minister of Belgium. So for all of you members of parliament who are interested in moving up the ranks and becoming presidents and deputy prime ministers depending on the situation. This is a required test. Asia-Europe People's Forum is a test for all of you before you become a president, prime minister, deputy prime minister, and so on and so forth. So I don't see many people smiling there. But anyway, the point is to make you smile and say, okay, people move on. Just as an outside. But I think, as members of parliament, we take oaths. We take an oath to protect the constitution of our country. We take oaths to protect and promote the interests of people. That's what we do. We look at the public finances. We look at how money is spent by our governments. We bring new legislations. And many of you, in your CVs have said the variety of legislations that you have brought in the interest of people. But today, we are confronted with a very unique problem. We are confronted with a very unique problem, the COVID-19, where you have about 43 million infections and almost 1.165 million global deaths. This is unprecedented. I don't think in modern history we have such big numbers. And the numbers are going to increase till you actually have an affordable vaccine. God only knows when this vaccine is going to come, but till the vaccine is available, this is going to confront us in our assemblies, in our legislative assemblies, in our parliaments, in our deliberations, and so on and so forth. So I think we are very confronted in a very big way, in some sense, an unprecedented way, on how we as members of parliament are challenged almost on a daily basis while we are on the ground, as well as we are in the assemblies or in the chambers where we debate and discuss on how we manage the COVID-19 situation. So, for example, how do we ensure that the poor, how do we ensure the informal worker, how do we ensure the vulnerable communities are protected by government and by the policies or the subsidies that the government is rolling out, and it does not turn out to become COVID subsidy for the rich. I mean, it's happening in some countries where you have COVID subsidy for the rich and not so much for the poor. How do we ensure, how do we protect democracy? How do we protect human rights in our countries, given that some countries have taken advantage of the COVID and have become far more dictatorial in character and have violated every possible human rights violations that you can think of. So you have countries that have become highly dictatorial, have become countries that are even planning to suspend parliament in order to push through some of the policies that they think is good, because they think parliament is not good enough. And we work in parliament, and our work as lawmakers is to legislate. When parliament is disbanded, then what is there to legislate? Our work becomes obsolete. And part of the discussion that we will have today, and I hope that we can talk about best practices that we are putting forward in our own countries, as well as outside of the box approaches. Outside of the box approaches, like the deficit question. Some people are saying, we cannot spend more than we have. We cannot go to a deficit. But what is wrong with having a deficit? When every country is having the same problem, are we still going to be dictated by these fund managers who tell us you can't have a deficit? So these are questions that seems to be coming up, and we all debate our budgets, and I think these are questions that people want some answers from parliamentarians, and especially from those of us who are here who are considered progressive parliamentarians. So these are some of the issues that we have in front of us. I will stop here, and I'd just like to remind us that we have 8 minutes for each of us, because there are quite a number of us here, and I think we want to have a very good discussion. And just make your first 2 points or first 3 points, but very, very short, so that we can have a nice, lovely discussion about the best practices, some of the changes that we want to bring to our own countries, that we can learn from each other, and the kinds of COVID projects that we are putting forward in our own countries. So let me reiterate an important point. Here we're talking about progressive policies in managing COVID-19, dialogue with parliamentarians. So let me formally invite, and let me just also share that we are all friends here, so I don't have to use your official title. I'm not a member of parliament, you're a congresswoman, you're a speaker, and so on. But since we are all progressive, I'm just going to assume that we are friends, and we're just going to go by our first names, if you don't mind. It's just too much to remember, actually. Anyway, let's start. First, we have Risa Hontiveros, an old friend of the Asia-Europe People's Forum as well, and she's from the Philippines, and first became a senator in 2016, and she has championed 14 landmark social protection laws. That's quite a feat for somebody for 14, though. I'm not going to read the whole. There's a long list of things that she has done, but phenomenal, I must say. But let's focus on what she has to say. Risa, it's all yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Charles. Sorry, I missed the. How many minutes did you say we should limit ourselves to?
8 minutes.
Okay,
8.
no problem. I won't use it up. And you don't have to call me Your Majesty in this forum.
Oh, no, not worry.
So, good afternoon, everyone, dear comrades and friends, and thank you for inviting me to this event, our event at AEPF. I prepared some notes, Charles, just so I won't forget. So I may go beyond 3 points, but not up to 8 minutes. As public servants, the highest level of trust we aspire for is securing the trust of the people. That amid the uncertainty wrought by the pandemic, we can provide social and economic support systems accessible to them. Hence, consultation is a central activity in shaping our roadmap towards better well-being for Filipinos. Active participation among our stakeholders is integral to the new roadmap we're drawing up. Together with our party Akbayan and the mass movement it's part of, we remain steadfast in pushing back against human rights violations that endanger democracy and spark violent reprisals against critics of the government. Imposing martial law-like restrictions as a response to a public health crisis like COVID-19 is a red flag. In the case of Metro Manila, checkpoints staffed with armed police were installed on the heels of confusing labels for quarantine restrictions. This pushed the dangerous narrative that the virus is hard to temper because Filipinos are naturally disobedient. Instead of attributing the rise of cases to the lack of contact tracing and the lax information dissemination, this narrative passes the blame on to the public, thus sparking cases of antagonism with authorities and eventually human rights abuses, as Charles said. Leading with a heavy hand, however, is not new under this administration. In fact, just this September, the European Parliament adopted a very strong resolution that threatened to revoke the Philippines' trading privileges with the European Union if the Philippines will not implement the international conventions on human rights. This is in light of President Duterte's flagship anti-drugs program that has led to thousands of cases of extrajudicial killings. The situation is so dire, the killings so frequent, that European lawmakers had to remind the Philippine government of its trade benefits under the Generalized Scheme of Preferences Plus, benefits which could be withdrawn if the government fails to meet certain standards. And this is just one of the many intercessions from international organizations since 2016. As a parliamentarian myself, I also make it a point to always speak up against human rights abuses under this administration. Sadly, most of us in the opposition have become a target for disinformation and misogynistic attacks on social media. Despite this, we continue to fight for our inalienable human rights, our freedom of expression, and the right to dissent. Now more than ever, the people must hear the side of the opposition because corrupt individuals and agencies are exploiting the pandemic as an opportunity for personal gain. In September, I exposed a list of contracts that procured overpriced personal protective equipment. At the budget deliberations, I flagged questionable proposals such as the 2 billion peso budget cut for the busiest public hospitals that take care of COVID-19 patients. We want pandemic-proof social and economic programs for Filipinos, and we will not let corruption, budget mismanagement, and even online intimidation derail us from our goal of a better life for our people. In light of this, we've shifted our recent stakeholder consultations to a higher gear because the ongoing budget deliberations in both houses of Congress give us a golden opportunity to shape the near future. Hence, I'm pushing for a more robust health budget that can respond to the challenges of the times. Right now, in the middle of a pandemic, the proposed health budget is merely the top five of priorities after education, national defense, public works, and interior and local government. Except for the education department, I believe the health sector simply cannot rank lower than the others. What is a pandemic budget for? It's for human resources, laboratories that process COVID-19 tests, assistance to community based health programs, and budget for other non communicable diseases like hypertension and diabetes. These are all important processes that contribute to the safety, security, and all our families and communities. This pandemic is also a litmus test for our universal healthcare law, which was passed in 2019. Hence, I vehemently oppose attempts to postpone its implementation during the pandemic. Coming from a developing country, I've also filed a resolution urging the government to support a global campaign that will ease intellectual property agreements on the COVID-19 vaccines. I hope government, through the Foreign Affairs Department, will boost the proposal of India and South Africa, urging the World Trade Organization to suspend the implementation, application, and enforcement of relevant provisions under the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights for the COVID-19 vaccine. During a worldwide public health crisis like the coronavirus, we must not tolerate roadblocks to affordable and effective vaccines for all. As parliamentarians, we must use all the handles available to us to be able to guarantee essential services for the people. Additionally, because of the dire situations that have developed out of the effects of COVID-19, our interventions also include a rapid and strategic response. There is enormous pressure for families to stay active and healthy despite the record high unemployment, threats to their livelihood, and an impending recession. Thus, we continue to be sensitive to the conditions of various sectors, especially the poor, marginalized, and those who work as frontliners. We continue to demand social amelioration for 1.2 million households. I've also been appealing for an additional budget for a supplemental feeding program for 1.94 million children aged 3 to 5 years old who are mostly undernourished and impoverished. Through our coalition partners, we've been able to extend relief and assistance to vulnerable groups, especially the senior citizens for COVID-19, but are often overlooked during relief operations. It's also a partner organization that flagged us about the challenges our public school teachers face as they transition to new modes of teaching and learning. I'm now lobbying to give our teachers an additional allowance so they can pay for the added cost of internet connection for their online classes. Another affected labor sector is our seafarers who are now in limbo because of the travel restrictions that have brought the maritime economy to a halt. I'm working on giving them a chance to get into comprehensive reintegration programs through the Magna Carta for Seafarers, as they've expressed increasing interest in other industries that may need their skills. I've also called a hearing with various organizations to identify the gender dimensions of the COVID-19 crisis and address the specific and disproportionate impacts of the pandemic on women and girls. Here, I learned of the rising cases of violence against women and girls, which are now considered a pandemic within a pandemic. Hence, I've asked the National Police and the Commission on Women to strengthen anti-domestic violence measures and to make sure their channels are open to victims of domestic violence. I believe any intervention that aims to improve the well-being of all should give our people the essentials of a dignified life, especially in the middle of a global pandemic. Every piece of information we gain during our intensive and collaborative sessions helps us make wiser and more calculated decisions that, in turn, make our economic safety nets and social protections stronger. To end, dear Charles and all other comrades, let me be frank saying that I believe we're already living in the so-called new normal. And if this new normal, if this is the new normal, allow me to say to you, my fellow lawmakers and comrades, we need to continue to strive for better. The people always deserve much better. Thank you.
Thanks, Risa. Thanks for that. Thanks for this very interesting, challenging, I must say. Thank you for that, Tom. Let me quickly introduce our next speaker. She comes to us from Sweden, Lotta Johnnson. She comes to us from the Left Party of Sweden, and she's also the elected Deputy Speaker of the Riksdag in Sweden. Lotta, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. And this is the first time that I participate in this organization, but I really look forward to listen to you all. Dear all, Sweden has been criticized and praised for our strategy during the corona pandemic, a pandemic that is far from over. Our strategy is not really as unique as many may think. We have not implemented any total lockdown. We have relied on people's own responsibility when it comes to keeping distance and washing hands, etc. People who have the slightest symptom of illness are told to stay at home. Those who are able to work are recommended to work from home as much as possible. There is also strong recommendation to avoid unnecessary traveling, especially by public transport. Primary school and preschools have not been closed. Universities and high schools use distance education during the spring, but these have opened during this autumn. We have banned gathering of more than 50 people. Now it will soon be changed to 300 people for events with seated audience, where a distance of at least 1 meter is kept. But when it comes to dance restaurants, however, there will be a sharpening with a limitation of 50 guests. The restrictions have hit tourism, culture and sports sector very hard. And the crisis has also led to an increase in unemployment, especially youth unemployment. We have also seen that violence against women has increased as a result of more people working at home. Sweden has a relatively high number of infected and dead in relation to the population, but it's too early to say whether this is due to our strategy. Several countries that had a total lockdown have been hit harder than Sweden. We have appointed a commission to evaluate the overall work around the COVID-19. I believe that our strategy has largely been wise, but our great failure is that we were not able to protect our older citizens. The death rate among the elderly is also high compared to the rest of the population. But the main reason for this was not the corona strategy, but shortcoming in elderly care and health care that existed even before the pandemic. During the Liberal and Conservative government period between 2006 and 2014, the work of creating a market-oriented healthcare was intensified. In the Stockholm region, for example, we now see how the profit for the healthcare companies goes before the needs. Every year, private healthcare companies in Stockholm take out more than 2 billion Swedish crowns in profit. My party, the Left Party, has therefore demanded more resources for healthcare and elderly care. We want to employ more nurses, assistant nurses, and doctors. We want to raise the salaries, especially for nurses and assistant nurses, and improve working conditions. We want to improve the opportunity for skills training. We want to abolish profits, interest in the entire welfare sector. Tax money should go to welfare, not to profit. After all, we have managed to receive all COVID-19 patients who were in need of medical care. Healthcare staff throughout Sweden have worked extremely hard for several months. Without the staff's extremely efforts, we would not have made it. The spread of infection dropped dramatically during the summer, and there was also very few deaths. In recent weeks, the spread of COVID-19 has increased again in some regions, which has led to stricter regional restrictions being introduced. The government has implemented a number of measures to limit the spread of infection and make it easier for those who have been affected. The Riksdag, the Parliament, has approved 10 amending budgets during the spring. Sickness and unemployment benefits have been raised temporarily. The state has promised to compensate municipalities and regions for extra costs in compensation with COVID-19. Companies have received extra support, including a system for short-term layoff. Support has also been introduced for specific sectors such as the media, culture, sport, public transport, railways, aviation, and shipping. The housing allowance has been increased for families with children. And in addition, the government has increased the support that goes to non-profit organizations that work to support vulnerable children and women who have been subjected to domestic violence. The left parties support these measures, but believe that they are not enough. Sweden must be better equipped in the future to meet crisis. Above all, it is necessary to strengthen welfare in general and health care and elderly care in particular. It is necessary to create stronger financial security systems, such as strengthened health insurance and unemployment insurance. We must also invest in education to meet growing unemployment, especially youth unemployment. But we also have to strengthen civil preparedness and increase support for the culture and leisure sector. The Riksdag, the parliament, has functioned throughout the crisis, and the democratic process has not been damaged. We have reduced the number of members in connection with voting to 55 members to reduce the risk of spreading the infection. However, all 349 members are in office and work either from home or in the parliament. Debates and decisions have taken place according to previous planning. MPs can participate in committee work physically or digitally. However, most meetings and seminars take place digitally. Corona pandemic is a global crisis and requires for that reason global solutions. We see how the most vulnerable people in the world have been hardest hit by the pandemic, particularly children and women. We see how poverty is increasing again in the world as a result of climate crisis, war and conflicts, and has been further worsened by the pandemic. We, living in the rich countries, have a special responsibility to assist and support the world's poor and those hardest hit by the crisis. And once the vaccine arrives, we must find a system so that it's distributed in a fair way and benefit everyone. No one should be left behind. Thank you so much for listening.
Oh, that was good. Thanks, Lotta. Thanks for this elaborate stuff that you guys are doing in Sweden. We should take up some of the issues that you had raised in terms of best practices. But before we do that, let me invite the next speaker, Dr. Syed Nasir Hussain. He comes to us from India, and he is elected to the Indian National Congress in 2018. And I understand he's also a much sought out after speaker, as well as particularly on geopolitics, globalization, as well as social protection. Dr. Syed Hussain, all yours. You need to unmute, I think. No, you haven't unmuted. Right.
Yeah, no.
You have 8
Thank you,
minutes.
Charles. Yeah, thank you, Charles. At the outset, I would like to thank Asia Europe People's Forum for inviting me to this deliberation today. I would also like to thank Professor Anuradha Chunai, who put me on to you people. It's an honor to be among such esteemed panelists and parliamentarians. I, being a member of an opposition Indian National Congress, slight correction in what Charles introduced. I've been elected to the parliament in 2018, not to INC. INC is my party. Indian National Congress is my party.
Sorry.
It's all right. We have been in the opposition for quite some time, and we have been suggesting, advising, fighting, opposing the policies of the government for quite some time here in India. The world is going through the most unprecedented times today, and nobody has seen such a crisis with a virus which has shaken the roots of global economy and healthcare to the core. In such a difficult time, how to help our fellow countrymen survive, stand up, move on, and become resilient for the future should be the questions we as parliamentarians should be asking ourselves today. What can be done when pandemics like this blow us over? The words like quarantine, lockdowns, social distancing, and so on have become the new normal. The style of functioning of the world, has changed. And in this time, India, with its almost 1.3 billion people, is going through a massive churn. For us, it has become quite distressing to see one challenge after another marring common man on a daily basis. Our government, that is the Modi government's lack of planning for economic and social reform is troubling us and has pushed India from a futuristic developing country, which we had given to them in 2014, to a struggling economy with lack of jobs, surfacing hunger and apathy in the streets and villages. The most heart-wrenching for me has been the sight of migrant laborers who were forced to return home, not through any means of modern-day transport, but on foot. This is something which cannot be imagined in these days. Today, I am talking to you from the state of Bihar, which is one of the most backward states. I'm here for an election campaign. I'm on this webinar from the midst of an election campaign in Bihar. I happened to meet lots of migrants who traveled all the way from the southern and the northernmost tips of our country, about 2,000 kilometers, 1,000 kilometers. They walked on back. They lost lives. They lost everything that they had done. Now there's nothing for them. Back home in a poor state like Bihar, they have nothing. No jobs, no livelihood, no policy to support them, no healthcare system, no education for the children. This is something which has caught the imagination of the people in our country. The suddenness and the unpreparedness of the lockdown in India, which was announced on the 24th of March by our Prime Minister, is something which hit us hard because there was no planning. There was no planning. There was no information. As it is, India lacks so much in healthcare infrastructure, especially the public healthcare infrastructure. The people didn't know what to do. The people were stray, migrants spread all across the country, laborers stranded all across the country. People didn't know where to go because there was so much chaos and confusion. And as a result of this entire chaos and confusion in our country, I think 4 core issues had a huge impact. One, I think I would like to say employment. The other is health. The third is revenue. And the fourth is policy. I think employment, all the businesses got shut down, especially the micro and the medium enterprises. People, those who are working on a daily wage basis. People, those who are working in construction industry. People, those who are working in the agricultural sector. They were the worst hit because all these small businesses got closed down because of the lockdown. And since there was lockdown, since the businesses got closed down, they didn't know what to do. The people, those who are manning these businesses, were not in a position to support the labor that they had hired from different parts of the country. And there was so much of chaos, so much of confusion in the country. There was no direction from the government, though no proper administration at the different levels. Some states tried to do their bit. Some states, it was worse. And especially when the lockdown was relaxed for some time, when the migrant workers were allowed to go back to their places, it was so unplanned. There were no proper transport system. Nobody knew when the pandemic will end. Nobody knew whether there will be a vaccine or not. Nobody knew where to go, when to go, and how to go. So because of this, the migrants had to leave their workplaces as far as 1,000, 2,000 kilometers, and they had to walk down back to their villages. I think this is something which not only brought in lots of unemployment, but also put all these daily wagers and laborers into a situation where either they had to just walk down back to the villages or they have to commit suicide. This was the kind of a system that was there. Uh, now the question between the before us, before the country was, especially before the people, those who were having businesses, is how to sustain their business, how to sustain hiring, how to sustain jobs. There was no proper direction, no proper policy from the side of the government. Unemployment was increasing, and especially very high in the unorganized sector, and there was reverse migration happening. This is something which has been seen for the first time in our country since independence. This is a new phenomena where people have migrated from rural areas to suburban and urban areas. We are going back to their own villages without having anything in their hands, without any financial backup, without anything that is being promised to them when they go back to their villages. This shutting down of large number of small and medium businesses in pan-India has hit the economy so hard that in the last quarter, our GDP had come down to minus 23.9. And both the central government and the state government were not in a position to help the people. Were not in a position to flush in the economy with funds. And neither the central government was in a position to support the state governments with the funds, as the economy was doing very badly. Sectors like hospitality, travel, tourism, retail businesses, entertainment, import, export, and trading, all these sectors were hit hugely. And since there was nothing coming out of these sectors, the country had to depend only on one sector, which did fairly well. That was the agricultural sector, where about 60% of our people work, whereas 60% of people are dependent for jobs. After that, when the parliament reopened after the lockdown, the government came up with this farm bills, which tried to snatch away the livelihood of the farmers. We tried to snatch away the land of the farmers, which was taking away a market system which was developed for the past 40-50 years in our country. There was huge resistance both in the parliament by the Congress and the opposition parties, and also by the farmers in the different parts of the country. I was one of the parliament members who was suspended for 8 days for opposing these bills during this pandemic times. But the point is, what do we do now? What kind of policy do we frame? What do we do to protect our people? What do we do to give some sort of social protection to the poor people of this country? This is something which is there on the minds of the parliamentarians, and especially the opposition led by the Indian National Congress, to which I belong, have been advising the government, have been proposing so many policies to the government, which the government is not ready to accept. I think, I don't know whether this government will come up with social protectionist policies or not, but I'm sure that there are enough parliamentarians in this country, there are enough political leaders in this country who are fighting for the cause of the poor of this country. Some state governments led by the left parties and the Congress parties, where the left and the Congress were ruling, did have some policies at the state level which had some sort of social protection to the people of this country. At the national level, I'm afraid that at least till the next 3-4 years, till this government lasts, I don't think there can be anything expected much, because this government has been pro crony capitalism, have been very friendly with crony capitalism in this country. Their policies have been pro crony capitalism. So I don't think anything much will come out of this government vis-a-vis social protection. But there are enough progressive leaders in political parties. There are progressive intellectuals in this country. There are progressive activists in this country who have been hearing their views and opinions, who have been asking for policies that protect the poor people of this country, that protect protect employment in this country, that fight for the farmers of this country. We in Congress, we have asked the government to come out with a direct money transfer scheme for the poor people of this country. We have asked them to double the allowances and the employment in Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme that was started by our government. We have asked them to flush the banks with funds so that enough loans can be given to MSME sector, that is the medium and micro enterprises sector, where I think about 30% of our business runs. These are some of the things that you have been asking the government to do. But I think
Syed, can we stop for, I mean, can we carry on later with the recommendations, because your time is already up? Let's get the others to also to present. And then we come back with your conclusion.
Yeah.
All right. Let me stop you here and invite the next speaker. But some of the recommendations that you're making, let's come back to that in our open discussion. So that we get hear others to speak as well. The next speaker comes to us from the British Labour Party. She's Nas Shas from the UK, British, of course. And she was first elected in 2015 as a member of Parliament for Bradford, and again re-elected in 2019. In July 2018, Nas Shas was appointed Shadow Minister of State for Women and Equalities. With that, let me welcome Nas Shah to make a presentation. You need to unmute.
Sorry.
Unmute,
Yep, I've unmuted. Thank you very much. Good morning, or it's certainly morning where I am. Don't know where other people are in the world. It's an absolute honour to be joining your panel this morning, albeit for a short time, because we have because of my shadow ministerial duties this morning, really. So first of all, I heard the last two speakers, and I just wanted to say, you know, some of those things that were said there, because I'm currently the Shadow Minister for Community Cohesion, and some of the things that were said there, unfortunately, even in England, we are experiencing very similar issues. So, for example, we it's quite embarrassing actually, because people look to Britain as the mother of all democracies, that we should have, if anybody should have been prepared, any country should have really had their things sorted and preparedness for a pandemic. It should have been the developed countries. And actually, it's turned out that we weren't. And we weren't for a number of reasons, because A, we had the issue of Brexit for a number of years before the pandemic hit. So that our preparedness wasn't there. The government didn't, and I am a member of the opposition, so I will speak like my the previous caller from a position of opposition and holding the government to account. Although I'll try and stay as neutral as possible for the purpose of today's talk, the truth remains that we weren't prepared. And in our country, we've had 10 years of austerity, which I feel has been a political choice, not a necessity. In the previous 10 years of a coalition, originally between the Lib Dems and the Tory party, and then following on that for the Conservative Party, the current ruling party, under different prime ministers. And we've had 3 elections in the past, you know, between 2015 and 2019, which is, you know, Brexit, lots of issues that, you know, a hung parliament, etc. You know, coalition has led us to. So that turmoil didn't stand us in good stead to be prepared as a country. And when you have 10 years of cut to your National Health Service, which is the pride of Britain by anybody's standards, you know, it does, the cracks are being laid bare open, really, really wide for the communities to see, for observers to observe. You know, that 10 years of cuts in the NHS in particular have really, really demonstrated, have been laid really, really wide open during the pandemic. So France and Germany have gone into their lockdowns, national lockdowns. We here are recommending a circuit breaker, which is what the government scientist advisors have said weeks ago, where our government is insisting on local lockdowns and different tiers. We have had, you know, initially we had the furlough scheme that comes to an end literally at the end of this, well, in the next day or two, because we had that since March for 6 months. And that comes to an end, which will mean lots of people in many up and down the country, perhaps going on to the state welfare system, which is now universal credit. Some businesses have had support. That support now depends on which tier of restrictions you're in. So I'm the Member of Parliament for Bradford West, and locally I represent one of, in terms of deprivation index for the UK, we are right up in the top 10. So a couple of wards in my area are really high on that deprivation index. So in terms of poverty, and that that's the embarrassing thing, I think, that even despite us being such a rich nation, we have so much poverty and inequality amongst our communities. It really, really is. It's horrible, and it's a shameful position to be in. But we are where we are. With what we've had in the last 10 years is we've seen a really real big rise of food banks and people relying on food banks. And now, more recently, we've been very much in the news. With our response to COVID, because it was very slow to begin with. It was very slow to begin with in terms of we didn't go into lockdown, despite us knowing what was coming down the track. When we did go into lockdown, we didn't have the right PPE equipment. When we did get the right PPE equipment, and I'm not sure it's still satisfactory, we then were very, very slow in our testing and tracing system. We were promised testing and tracing system to be really, really, world class on the 1st of June by our Prime Minister. We still haven't got the test and tracing system reaching 80%, which is what is required for that test and trace system to work for us to get ahead of the disease. So from a national COVID perspective and how we're dealing with the pandemic, we could have done a great deal better. We've also seen a real north-south divide being exposed, which was always there, but really coming out during the pandemic. The pandemic really does highlight what has happened with in the northern areas, and I come from the north. I'm in West Yorkshire, so that has really impacted on our resilience, on our dealing with the pandemic, the kind of funding, the packages that we're getting from government or not getting from government, knee-jerk reactions to things. So we've passed lots of legislation during when COVID came in those last weeks of March when we went into the lockdown. We did pass much legislation to give us new powers. I suppose the things that have come out of COVID, which I hope that there are some practices that we will adopt as a nation. So, for example, in the NHS, there used to be lots of bureaucracy and red tape that we had to go through to do certain things. So now we have easy ways of doing things because COVID has enabled that. COVID has enabled us to work from home and be effective. And for my staff team certainly work from their own homes, and that's proved effective. So locally, it really, really is difficult with poverty, with free school meals. We want to provide free school meals. That's one of our big campaigns at the moment to children who are, whose parents relied on free school meals to be able to get an extra meal in during the day, and that hasn't happened. And we've had a really high-profile footballer who's been leading that campaign. We had a U-turn in, earlier on in the year, and we're hopeful we get a U-turn from the government during the Christmas holidays as the businesses have stepped up during this, because at this moment in time this week we're in a half-term period. So we have lots of challenges, but some of in terms of the global or where Britain is in terms of how we've responded, we've not responded the way some countries have, and we have a lot to learn. So we're the only G20 nation that has, that out of all the G20 nations, our response has been pretty poor in terms of it's the first time that we've been downgraded by Moody's in terms of our rating, our credit rating. We're the only G20 nation that has got there. So that makes us wonder what the Chancellor has been doing wrong in Great Britain, and he clearly hasn't got it right. So our response, I don't feel it's been right, but then I am a member of the opposition, where we have tried as opposition, tried to work with the government, to support the government as much as we possibly could, whilst trying to work in with them, because pandemics and crisis need leadership, and leadership requires unity. So we've tried in the first few months really, really hard to work with government, and that has, when we've had a government which hasn't been on top of this and had chances time and time again and completely fails to miss those opportunities to make the right changes, then it becomes really, really difficult, and then we have to shine a spotlight on those government failures. So I think for us, that those have been the real challenges. What I'm really proud of is how we have really, really come together as communities. So I come from one of the most diverse, I'm a Pakistani heritage, I come from one of the most diverse cities in the whole of the United Kingdom. And we have really, really seen the best of British. We've seen the best of British coming out and people helping those communities and setting up infrastructure support for organizations and helping each other. And my worry is globally is that this pandemic came on the backdrop of a real conversation about nationalism, real pandering to political, but the Donald Trumps of this world, the rhetoric of division that comes from Narendra Modi, the rhetoric of division that comes from, these whole issues, this global conversation, which is, at times it's very fascism, the rise of fascism. Christchurch happened, Pittsburgh has happened, lots of other issues. My worry is, and my hope, I suppose, is also to counter that, is that we come out of this as united countries. We've got a lot to learn from places like Africa, who those countries that really did have their systems in place because they've dealt with crises like Ebola, they've dealt with other SARS, etc. They had their infrastructure in place, and there's lots for us to be learning from those countries of how, despite the economic infrastructure not being part of like Great Britain's is, the fact that how people had came together. So those are my hopes and prayers really for the future. And I am going to have to leave you because I am due into another meeting now. But many thanks for the invitation today.
Well, thanks for joining us as well. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
The last speaker for today or this evening, at least in my case, is the evening. Some of you just in the morning. Is the Member of Parliament from Mongolia, and comes to us from the center-left Mongolian People's Party. Please welcome Ms. Tserenjamts. Am I getting that right? I'm sorry if I pronounce it wrongly. Apologies.
Yeah, it's okay. Please call
How do
me.
you pronounce the name?
Oh, it's too difficult.
Oh.
Munkhtsetseg. Please call me Munkhtsetseg.
Okay, it's going to take some practice, but go ahead.
Please call me just Mookie.
Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. I will share my presentation. Are you see the presentation?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm happy to share with you Mongolian overcome experience a COVID pandemic. Yeah, Mongolia is the please share. Oh, okay. Mongolia has one of the successful overcome country. We have still no diff, and also we hasn't any community transmission. All the cases Mongolia is imported from abroad. Also our government announced the various measures to control the outbreak early. It means in January 2020, Mongolia with working World Health organizations very activated the country's interagency emergency management system. Also, we have with early halted all international flights and trains by early March, when its first case was confirmed. Mongolia requires that anyone arriving to abroad testing, spend the 3 weeks in government monitoring quarantine, and also everyone to additional home self-quarantine. Also, the population of Mongolia support our government response measures to COVID pandemic. For example, on May 2020, by the opinion poll, about half of the public opinion is support our government policy. Still, our border closures is extended until December 22. We have strict some strong measures against pandemic. I would like to say some political situation in Mongolia. We have please to the next slide. Okay. Yeah. We have allowed the country to hold successful elections on 24 June 2020. It was a very special election. And many countries' elections were disturbed or postponed, but Mongolia followed the example set by South Korea in April 2020 and decided to move forward with the election as planned. I was the first time ran this election. It was very special and for me also very difficult because all the candidates should be with a face mask. It was very difficult to people to identify them, especially for me, like as new candidates. Also, the most of election campaign should be transformed online. It was sometimes very difficult. Also the public utterance restricted. We have the public distancing regulations. All the polling station was like temperature measurement, hand sanitism, and disinfection of voting machines. But our Mongolian voters support the government policy, and we have our ruling Mongolian People's Party win 62 of 76 seats. It was a very historical victory of these elections. Also, we have a local election we held on 15 October 2020. It was also successful, but the turnout is very low because it was a pandemic everywhere. Also, we have some negative files of COVID-19 situation in Mongolia. Please, next slide. Our global economic slowdown, also the border closures have severely negative impact on our economy and also society. As Risa Hontiveros mentioned that in Mongolia, so the domestic violence and child abuse was increased during this lockdown time. Also, there's some negative influence of our education sector. Almost 1,900,000 children under the age 18 were affected by the closures. All the schools, kindergarten and high schools. Also, the most negative impact is the economic, especially our GDP fell and government deficit was increased. In the first 6 months of 2020, Mongolia GDP fell 9.7%. Also, the exports fell by around 40%, and the government deficit rose almost 10% of GDP as revenues fell and expenditures rose to address the pandemic. Mongolia's exports are dominated by natural resources such as coal, copper, and also the oil. It was all the fallen international demand. Yeah, please next. Mongolian plants and government had a lot of measures against the pandemic. We have adopted a special law on package measures for protecting citizens' health, income, job keeping, and economic recovery during coronavirus pandemic. In order to prevent the spread of the virus, mitigate the social economic impact. Thus, the law authorized the government to regulate quarantine, traffic movement, and other public security measures to stop the spread of the virus. Also, our government had agreed to pay social insurance contributions due to employers of private entities, also the enjoys public and private universities, as higher education institutions, and by individuals who pay social insurance contributions voluntarily. The finance minister clarified that almost all companies in Mongolia, including those experiencing the slight decline or decrease in their revenue. And we have the free from paying social insurance contribution until October 2020. Also, our Central Bank of Mongolia decided to postpone loan principal interest payments to extend payment schedules for the 3 months for holders, 8 to 5% mortgage loans for borrowers' individual requests. So I will make my presentation too short. Please go. One more. Okay. Yeah, okay. I would like to point how our progressive parties and progressive politicians to approach to COVID-19. COVID-19 is only the health disease, but is also economic and social crisis. I think so. The COVID-19 is deepening global inequality. Before coronavirus, inequality was already increased in many parts of the developing world, but the pandemic is going to greatly heighten existing economic and social inequalities. For example, the first one is the jobs. The pandemic has increased inequality between workers. The vast majority of workers in developing countries such as Mongolia and Asian countries in informal jobs without access to types of the support that workers in rich countries get from the government, such as Fornarve schemes. While many developing countries have increased the scale social protection measures in response to pandemic, this is clearly not enough. Also, the second inequality is the digital divide. The pandemic is contributing to acceleration in technological change, helping certain businesses to stay open digitally and enabling many people work to home who were previously unable to. But the countries, those citizens have access to the internet and are the well educated, will gain from the more to online technologies such as Zoom for virtual meetings. Also, the gender gap is more difficult questions in this pandemic period. As you mentioned, our members say that women are more likely to take care of children's housework. It means that women across the world are also the much more likely to hold jobs. Is very difficult people in this pandemic period. Also, the domestic violence, child abuse, and joblessness, especially for women, is great. Last one is the access to vaccine. The COVID-19 vaccine, as once is developed, will determine the scale and the speed of recovery from the pandemic. But as low-income countries, it will bear heavy costs, both human and economic. I have mentioned this commitment to reducing inequality index shows that only 26 out of 158 countries will spend and recommended 15% of the budgets on health period to the pandemic. And 102 countries, at least one, the free workers lack basic labor rights and protections, like sick pay when the virus is struck. Please, my slide. Yeah, I would like to end my presentation with the words the Director of International Development Finance, Mr. Matthew Martin. He said that extreme inequality is not inevitable, and you don't have to be a wealthy country to do something about it. We know that policies such as free public health care, safety nets for people who can't work, decent wages, of fair tax system have been proven to fight inequality. Government must learn the lessons of this pandemic and seize this opportunity to build fairer, more resilient societies and better tomorrow for us all. Yeah, that's all my say to.
Charles, could you unmute, please?
All right, I'm unmuted. Thanks for that, our colleague from Mongolia. Thanks for that great presentation. Now we go to the second part of our program, which is basically an open discussion that needs to take place. But before that, let me just quickly sketch out some of the issues that had come up, just in a very broad brush sense, and then we can go to the specific questions that our viewers have. Though I think some of the issues that were raised was, I think, in the case of India and also some other countries, that it was the COVID plans and programs were poorly planned, thought out, and implemented. I think that was the case of India that was raised by Dr. Syed Naseer. I think there was also the notion that in some countries, existing inequality, existing poverty was made worse as a result of the COVID-19, including a digital divide that already existed in the country. It became worse after the COVID-19 situation. And of course, it placed a huge pressure, and I think some of your presentations pointed out to that, on the healthcare system. So some of the poorly thought out, poorly funded healthcare system were really challenged. And I think the COVID really put pressure on that. And then there was also the notion that was raised, the third point, that countries started becoming authoritarian, as well as stifle human rights, the third point that was made. And then you had also people-centered problems. I think almost in every country that we saw, we heard, you had problems with the lack of food, malnutrition, we had business closing up, small and medium industries particularly affected, migrant workers facing specific problem, the notion of a reverse migration in India, domestic violence, child abuse, something that I think we saw in all of the countries. I think there was also the governments were hurrying and trying to put more money on social insurance, social protection, and improve or they really help to enhance the problematics social protection that they already had, the suffering social insurance schemes that they already had. The governments were trying to beef up some of this. I think another point that was raised, also issue of loan moratorium. The SMEs could not pay, families could not pay, houses could not pay, poor communities were unable to pay their loans. So there was a loan moratorium, I think, in some countries. I think the last point is the global issue regarding suspending the intellectual property rights of the TRIPS agreement, so that there could be generic production and that more countries and more developing countries can take advantage of the vaccine if and when it comes on board. So basically, you can see some of the, I just raised some of the issues that I thought was common to our discussion just now. But I'm going to ask Kathy to raise the specific questions that have already come up. Kathy, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Charles. I think you summed up indeed quite a few things that are common amongst the different MPs present here. And what I think would be interesting to have as the first question is what we saw as questions from Anuradha Chenoy and Andy Rutherford that are already part of APF. And this is to do with the people's agenda, and where we see a lot of people's demands that are actually being brought up by the different members of parliament here present. So our question is actually, or their question is actually, like, how can we bring these to higher levels? Because we have a people's agenda with these demands. And one of the things is that we would like all members of parliament to sign on to these. And I think, Charles, you're quite an ambassador for this as well. But the question is, how can we take it forward? Like, what should we do as a network and as an organization to make sure that people's demands are, brought to the levels where decision-making is being done? Maybe, Charles, you can try and see who we should address this question to first, or do we, ask all of you? I'm not sure. What would be the best?
I think this kind of questions, everybody has to answer.
Yeah, that's true. Okay.
Because this is something that you have to do as part of your work as a parliamentarian. And the People's Agenda essentially talks about all the issues that have already been raised. but this is a formal process. And I think the People's Agenda is interesting in the sense that it's an interface between civil society's effort and also parliamentarians. So therefore, it'd be great if we can have a debate discussion or it's coursed through the select committees in different countries and different legislative assemblies. It'd be interesting, be good, and it'll be challenging as well. I know in other forums it has taken place, but I think we can give it a try as part of the Asia-Europe People's Forum. Maybe Risa can do that. She'll start off with telling us how she's going to do it.
I will support Charles's suggestion and seriously bring it up in the Senate in the Philippines, and also search for counterparts in our House of Representatives who could also sign on to, and then translate the People's Agenda into various forms, communications with the executive, even though we are in opposition, and then engage on this with our partners in civil society, and maybe even some select stakeholders in the private sector. And I want to add that it would be important to pose this agenda in our national and regional fora as our engagement in the issue of what does the new normal mean. Because of course, for those who were already in positions of dominance in the old normal, which was not normal, which was very abnormal, probably they are constructing their design of the new normal simply to restore the old relations, the old structures, the old systems. But for us, progressive parties and movements, it's always been with a critical eye about the old abnormal and really pushing forward alternatives to health and economic systems, among others, that have already been marked by so much inequality and injustice in the past. And as I think all our colleagues who shared said, have simply been exposed and because of the pandemic and the resulting reset. So I think it would be really good for us together and separately, parallel, to engage that question of what do we mean by the new normal. Try to set the tone, try to set the terms of that debate, and use the People's Agenda as a major content in our proposals about the new normal. Thank you, Charles.
All right, Naseer, do you want to jump into this and see how we can do this in India?
See, I think you all know that India has of late taken a right-wing shift. The politics in our country has taken a right-wing shift. I think we need to accept this. But there are movements happening in different parts of the country. The progressive parties, including my party, are resisting the anti-people policies of this government, both at the state level and the union government level. But what we need to do is that we need to bring. There are alliances between the various progressive parties in our country, but that is not enough. I think that is generally taken at the level of the strategy as to how do we fight these reactionary forces in the parliament and also outside the parliament. But what is more important is we need to have forums created. We need to have some sort of a forum where different representatives of different political parties, especially those opposing these right-wing parties, come together, have this kind of discussion very regularly, and then frame some sort of an. We need to come to a common point where we can agree that we need to do this kind of a policy intervention, and maybe then we can ask our own parties to intervene in the parliament through the parliamentary institutions that we have evolved both at the state level and the central level, and then that is how I think we can push it through. But for this to have some sort of a debate and discussion, we need to have some sort of a forum of the progressive parliamentarians in our country, which I think is lacking in our country. We need to develop that.
Thanks for the answer, though. Our colleague from Mongolia, what can we do in Mongolia with the People's Agenda?
Yeah, Yeah, I agree with you. I think so that we need to, all the stakeholders such as civil societies, organizations, and as the private sector companies, and as a state, it means the local and national level, we could cooperate together these pandemic measures. For example, today our parliament has adopted a new committee, which was to oversee the implementation of a COVID pandemic against law. It means we can audit out all these government budget to against pandemic, and also we need to oversee the foreign investment and foreign donations, also the foreign loan. The Mongolia now has a lot of the international donations to fight against pandemic, and therefore we need to together cooperate and this private partnership, civil society, and also the local and government. This is not only the health crisis, it's all the societies must be together to fight.
Thanks.
Yeah, I would like to add some point. We need to together close to media, because this period of pandemic has spread a lot of the fake news. It is very difficult for public opinions. Yeah, we should be together.
What are the issues that we didn't get the chance to talk very much here? Is the attack on refugee communities as well as migrant communities in some of our countries. I mean, in the case of Malaysia, Al Jazeera, the television channel based in Doha, ran a story talking about the problems that migrant workers were facing in detention and how sometimes they have to go into hiding while they are working in the country itself. One of the guys have been put out of the country, but the whole point I want to make is that migrant workers are seen as part of the problem in spreading the virus. And as such, you actually stigmatize migrant workers, including refugees, as contributing to the contributing to the spread of COVID-19. Do you have similar experiences in your own countries on something like that, and how has the government dealt with it?
In Mongolia, the first transmission confirmed case was the Frenchman who was traveled from Moscow. That time, there's some discrimination anti-foreign peoples, such as these Frenchmen, and also there's some fake news on Chinese people, because the coronavirus first one started from Wuhan, China.
Mm-hmm.
Now the time, this is not so high, but sometimes we have to see the most of the social media content related hate speech. Also some discrimination who has the confirmed cases.
Anybody else on the issue of migrant workers or refugees? For example, in Singapore, the government in the first instance only tested local people. They did not test migrant workers who made up a huge, significant population, working population in the country. And the numbers started shooting up in the case of Singapore. And it was very interesting, the Prime Minister actually went on public radio, or public television, and actually told the Singaporean citizens that migrant workers are part of Singapore. They've come to work here, they've come to help contribute to the welfare of the country, the well-being of the country, the prosperity of the country as well. So it was really quite good to see a leader who actually recognized that they had made a mistake and actually not formally apologizing about it, but acknowledging that they made a mistake in the way they were testing people, and they should have tested the migrant workers also as part of the overall mass testing that Singapore was doing. In Malaysia, you have a problem with the government and especially vigilante groups pushing very hard on trying to put the blame on migrant workers or at least the refugees. But I think as part of our work that we do, we need to fight back on this. We need to fight back, and we need to be the voice protecting migrants as well as refugees in our countries, because they're really quite powerless and they have no representation in the country. So some of us have to play that role. But let's leave that as a point of action that we need to talk about. Kathy, any questions? That because I'm looking at the time.
Yes.
We don't have much time.
Charles, we don't have much time, but I think it would still be important and very interesting to also hear Lotta's take as a European voice when it comes to the people's agenda. To see, I don't think we heard her reaction to that. No?
I don't see her at all. I only see her name.
Oh,
is she around?
I think she is still here.
I am. I'm still here. Yeah.
Okay.
How? Yes. This is the first time that I participate in this, so I'm not so familiar with the people's agenda. But I think I understand more or less what you mean. I do believe that it's extremely important to support and to cooperate with the civil society, and especially with the people's movement like trade unions, to listen to them and to try to raise their issues in the parliament. And we do have a very good cooperation already in Sweden with civil society and the people's movement. But I also would like to say that according to the last question, that I think that the base for accusing immigration workers for the infection is economic. So the most important thing that we have to do is to fight for a more equal economic world, which is not that easy, of course, but this is what we have to do to get more fair taxation systems, etc. I think this is so important to solve the problems in the long term. I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Charles, would you, I see Risa would like to react to that. And then Charles, I'm looking at you to see if we are going to have one last question after Risa's reaction. Is that okay?
I think Syed too wants to say something. So maybe Risa and then Syed.
Oh, okay. Yes, I didn't see that. Sorry.
Syed
Okay.
raised his hand before me, so it's okay. Please go ahead.
Okay.
No, it's okay, Risa. I think on the question of different communities being abused or targeted or attacked, I think India had seen an unprecedented social and communal divide on an issue like this pandemic. There was one event in Delhi where I think it is called as an gathering. It's an istema. It's a gathering of some spiritual people. They were all stuck up. Say about 1,000+ people were stuck up in a building when the lockdown was announced. I think a couple of them got infected with COVID. And then there was this huge news in all the television channels saying that people belonging to a particular community all have gathered, they have been infected, they have come from different parts. I mean, some Malaysians were also there, Indonesians were also there in that. Then that becomes such a huge news. And so many debates were there, so much of fake news was there. They were arrested, they were taken for testing, they were kept separately. So many things happened. And because of the kind of atmosphere that was created by the media debates and media news, there was so much of violence across the country in different, especially in the rural areas. India has never seen communal or social divide in the rural areas. But this is for the first time we had incidents where people belonging to minority communities were targeted, they were beaten up, they were imprisoned, abusers were hurled against them. I think it was a very difficult time for the minorities, especially during the COVID time. And because we have a government in India which has fascist leanings, and the way they've tried to control the media, the way they are trying to control all the institutions and the agencies of the government, it is very easy to spread fear among the minorities, which they do with the help of the social media and also the mainline media channels. I think this is something which has never been seen. And the kind of violence that has been seen in rural areas is something which is unprecedented. I think this has been taken up by the mainland parties and progressive politicians, parliamentarians, and parties. But I think this is something which any authoritarian rule can do by targeting a section of people even during the pandemic times.
Risa, you want to go?
Thank you, Charles. Yes, just about your question also about migrant workers, refugees. Well, particularly about overseas Filipino workers, since arguably overseas Filipinos make up 10 or more % of our total population, and they've had a really rough time during this pandemic. For example, Filipino healthcare workers, say in the United States, getting sick, not having health coverage of their own, being alone at home, not able to get tested or treated, and some of them really dying alone, or other Filipino overseas workers, say in some countries in the Middle East, their travel documents lapsing, and then they're being stranded. They're not repatriated, but no longer employed, and reduced to trying to find food where they can, and such. So not so much, as far as Filipinos abroad are concerned, I think not so much being blamed for the spread of the coronavirus, but really having little or no social protection in their host countries. And I'd like to link it to a question I saw from a compatriot of mine and comrade in our movement in our Q&A box, from Ellen Sana of the Center for Migrant Advocacy. Yes, I've started to from her today and from others, the idea about debt and remittances. And it's also, I saw a related question from Ms. Nalini, about the possibility of debt forgiveness by the global north towards the global south. And I really think we should explore this as a possible campaign of maybe not just overseas Filipinos, but migrant workers of different countries who remit, like overseas Filipinos do to the Philippines. And if there is a way that this can be tied to debt forgiveness by the global north, especially since there are already, I think, UNCTAD principles. Lotta, correct me if I'm wrong. I think these were proposed by a fellow Scandinavian country of yours. I think it was Norway, but eventually carried by the UNCTAD, that there are principles of responsible borrowing and lending between global north and south countries. Maybe we can get some principles there from a campaign. So some of my concrete takeaways from our discussion are that things about things we can do together. So a campaign on this idea about linking debt and remittances, including a possible debt forgiveness arrangement, and then the People's Agenda as a major input of ours on the debate on what does the new normal look like. And maybe last but not the least, to take up that campaign that's already being started by some formations about a people's vaccine, that when the vaccine or vaccines are finally discovered or invented, that they should be for all countries, not just for the rich, and for all people within the countries, not just for the rich. And maybe that's also something that we can do together, following also speaking of Syed, following the lead of India and South Africa vis-a-vis the World Trade Organization. Thank you, Charles.
Thanks, Risa. I just like to, are we concluding now? I think time to conclude.
I think it is time to conclude because it's already 12:30 in Brussels now. So I think, yes.
Okay. I think as a way of concluding and as a way of bringing all of this together, let's look at the future as well. I think, it's a good time to reset our economies, to rethink the way we organize our economies, I think this is the best time to move away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. It's also a good time to look at promoting and strengthening public health care. And I think this is something that we really have to think about and move towards protecting the environment, including our rivers, social protection for all, strengthening social protection in countries that needs greater protection for its people. And I think this is a great opportunity. Well, you know, in the Chinese say, when there's a crisis, it also offers you opportunities. And I think going into renewable energy, strengthening our social protection will be a great effort, especially at this moment in time. There's a great need for that. A rich country like Malaysia is suffering, is really suffering as a result of existing problems, and existing problems now have been exacerbated, and people are just falling into poverty. And the disaster is that because of the way we manage our economy, even a small change in the economy, or small like this COVID pandemic, has pushing millions of people back to poverty. And I think this is the time to rethink the way we organize ourselves and organize our economy. So, on that note, folks, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure. And I would like to pass it back to Kathy. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And maybe also to say that indeed we did not manage to address all the questions, which we knew beforehand, of course. But just to say, this is not the first nor the last dialogue with parliamentarians that we will have as Asia-Europe People's Forum. So we will take those questions and go back with them in all our different working groups and clusters also, to make sure that in next and upcoming dialogues with parliamentarians, we will bring them up definitely. So please do get in touch and stay in touch also with us, so that we can make sure that we put all of your demands on the agendas. I think that is also very important. So yeah, and of course, thank you once again for all your times as members of parliament. We know that it's crisis in every country at this moment. So we are, we recognize the fact that you are here and that you have taken 1.5 hours to be with us. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thanks for the time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye
Stay
bye.
safe.
Bye
Bye,
bye.
everyone. Thank you so much.